Namo Namaha. Some invocation, I think, to the celestial beings. Om Paramatmane Namah, Om Parabrahmane Namah, Om Narayanaya Namah, Om Saraswatyai Namah, Om Ganapataye Namah, Om Gurubhyo Namah. Many years ago, I attended a lecture, and the lecture spoke about reason, rationality, and our ancient tradition. But then the tone changed when the topic came up about the Puranas. So the Puranas are what we may call, using Western terminology, mythological stories. Now, some have objections to the term mythological. I don't get caught up in things like that. But the issue that the individual had was that these stories, these Puranic stories of the Devi Devta, the gods and goddesses, were irrational. And in fact, in Star Wars, they were simply just make-believe things. That didn't sit well with me. The Hindu civilization is one of the last civilizations which has a cosmology filled with polytheism. And we often shy away from that. We often see that as a pejorative term. No, we're a monotheistic culture. We're not polytheistic. I proudly say we're polytheistic. Every ancient society was polytheistic. But then it requires us to understand what we mean by polytheism. The world of the cosmology that Hindus have of many gods and goddesses, for me, exemplifies a world of color. And I love color. You take that away, you have dryness, you have grayness. So you have these texts, these Puranas, and they talk about various gods and goddesses, their stories, and of course, ours wasn't the only civilization to have these. Every civilization had these, until monotheism took over, and ours was virtually the last one. So are these stories simply just fantasies, ridiculous Star Wars things? Like I said, that didn't sit well with me, and for reasons I'll explain shortly. Elsewhere, I've heard people criticize something like astrology, and it's those Hindus who have a scientific background, and yet deem it to be irrational. We're rational, we're scientists, we don't believe in things like that. Do they know what science is? I have a scientific background myself. We function in a world where we use models. We don't know how anything works. The world's an utter mystery. Existence is a mystery. Every aspect of life is a mystery. All we're using are concepts to try and make sense of reality, be it at the scientific level, be it anthropological, be it spiritual. We are creating conceptual models. And so those scientists who deem to have things absolutely have a limitation in their understanding. Because actually, if we look back a few hundred years ago, in the West, when Newton started the conversation about gravity as a force, he didn't have the explanatory tools for it. It took a few hundred years for Einstein to come around and provide a model based on the warping of space-time. So he now has developed a model which is an explanatory tool for how gravity works. Doesn't mean gravity wasn't there. So in the world of astrology, particularly Vedic astrology, Jyotish, it's far from irrational. The fact is, the thing works. Whether we have an explanatory tool for it is another story. So let's look at a little bit about this. Just go through a few subjects that the ancient world dealt with. They were aware of the visible planets. We look up, we see stars. I don't know if you're aware, but a few days ago, on the weekend in fact, when you look up at the full moon, there was a star next to it. Anybody notice it? Okay, it's to the right. On Sunday it was. We would just think it's a star. It was particularly the planet Jupiter. The ancients had awareness of these things. How? It boggles the mind. How they had access to the depths of information. And the more one studies a subject like Jyotish, one gets to appreciate how deeply intellectual, how profound the thinking, the intelligence was of our ancestors. It is an entire subject in itself. It's a study of time. It's a study of causation. It's a study of oneself and how one connects with the universe. It doesn't treat the individual as an isolated being. It understands that we are, as individuals, within a system of Prakriti, within a system of nature. And there is a flow to nature. Things are not sporadic. So there's very profound philosophy embedded within this stuff. You take something like Vedic maths. The ancient world developed 16 sutras, 16 aphorisms, and within these 16, all of maths can be placed. The entirety. So subjects which we think are unrelated, but some topic in geometry, and then some topic in calculus, and we think, or a topic in algebra, and we think that these particular topics are not connected. You link them back to a single sutra. What's going on with the genius of the ancient mind? And we think the Puranas are ridiculous stories. There are subjects like Vastu Shastra. There are subjects like Ayurveda. I mean, we take something like Ayurveda. Again, we don't necessarily have explanatory models using the Western systems that have been developed. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. 3 doshas. Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. Okay, so loosely translated as air, fire, and phlegm. Now, where I can download a tick sheet off the internet and look at all these different characteristics, and I can tick them through, and I can go, okay, predominantly I'm this dosha, secondary level I'm this dosha. And then I go to an Ayurvedic doctor, and he simply feels my pulse, looks at my tongue, and says, your predominant dosha is this, your secondary dosha is this. What's going on? And then we hear about, in ancient times, and apparently there are still a few left, so I've heard, whether this is true or not, where out of modesty, a male doctor, wouldn't physically touch a female. So he would tie string around her wrist and feel the vibration of the pulse and then determine her dosha. If this isn't genius, I don't know what is. Just that alone. Let me just go back to Jyotish a sec. There is one thing about reading charts, and of course, how the system works, one needs to provide explanatory models for this. I have one, but it's just a model. I don't buy the idea that there are planets up there which cause a direct effect on us through gravity or electromagnetism that affect our lives and how our lives flow. There is no connection between those things. I have a very different model for that. However, there is a particular branch of astrology, of Vedic astrology, called Nadi astrology. And these are ancient leaves. Now, no one knows where they've come from. Could be hundreds of years old, 1,000 years old. But legend has it that all that time back, when astrologers were apparently so good, they wrote down about the lives of everyone to come. And the gods, not being too happy about humans having this much power and knowledge, decided to send a great fire to burn them. Well, they didn't all get burnt. The ones that survived belonged to those who were apparently destined to see them. Now, it's an interesting experience with Nadi astrology. You don't go to a Nadi astrologer to get an interpretation done. They're not looking at a birth chart where there's subjective interpretation based on rules. What's going on here are these leaves written in whatever language, depending on where it's come from, where those leaves are acquired. And in there are written all these details about your life, all by merely just giving a thumbprint. And in there, a number of questions asked, and through elimination, you then find your leaf, if you're destined to see it, of course. Now, it's all a very profound experience when sitting there. Even though I've been a number of times and I've taken friends, I still am amazed I'm amazed by the information that comes out about those individuals. Not least when the individual says, your father's name is this and your mother's name is this. How did they know? And you've come to get your leaf read at such and such age. And the positions of the planets when you are born are the following. Such and such planet in this constellation. And it matches up with your birth chart. It boggles the mind how the ancients knew these things. What explanation does any physicist give to this? In fact, I have a colleague who's a physicist, and I'm about to take him to go and see this guy. And he's a theoretical physicist and one of the most intelligent men I've ever met, but he's boggled by this. And so, yeah, I'll be taking him. So things like this. The ancients come out with these sorts of things, and the Puranas are just mere stories. Now then we come to something which is very dear to me, the Sanskrit language, the height of genius. The more and more I probe into this, the more I get educated about this, I know nothing compared to the ocean that is Sanskrit. The more I'm blown away by the fact that the ancients had, forget the ancients, that human intelligence has the capability of coming out with some of these things, of theories of language. Put language aside, just phonetics alone. Which other alphabet system, which other syllabary has devised an order, a structure, based on phonetics, on how the sound comes out of the mouth, where it comes from the mouth? There is an entire system of rules with this. One could just drown themselves alone with just a study of phonetics and be amazed. And that's not even going on to the language itself. I don't think we come out as a civilization today, I mean as a world civilization, we certainly haven't come out with things in that profound manner. We've come out with things in certain scientific ways. But with regard to things like language and the roots of language, I've not seen anything, and I'm an avid linguist. Now these Puranas, what are they written in? They're written in Sanskrit. And these are Mickey Mouse stories. I don't think so. Now embedded within these Puranic texts, embedded within this is profound philosophy. So let's just move on to the realm of philosophy. We're standing on the shoulders of giants here. Take someone like Adi Shankaracharya. In his teens, he's written commentaries in Sanskrit on the Upanishads, on the Brahma Sutras. We really are standing on the shoulders of giants here. And that philosophy is embedded within these Puranic texts. So are our ancients that simple-minded? Far from it. The attitude, the spirit of ancient India was one of investigation. And that is what I find beautiful about this. It isn't one about belief. It isn't one about imposing belief, as we see elsewhere around the world. Ancient India was about investigation. Investigation into so many different areas, be it the ones I've mentioned, language, maths, astrology, astronomy, and also other subjects. The investigation is about the nature of reality, but then the spirit in which this is done. Now you see on social media, what do we see? When I've had debates and discussions on social media, you provide the argument, you provide the logic, you provide the evidence, and yet the individual at the other end, the keyboard warrior, doesn't want to know. They still want to hold their belief. Yes, so much for the quest for truth. So much for being honest within oneself. Yet you have someone like a Purva Mimasika, like Mandana Mishra, debating with the Uttara Mimasika, Adi Shankaracharya. And they're debating for weeks. And there's a lot at stake here. And yet when they're debating, they come to the realization of who the victor is and who the vanquished is. And what does Mandana Mishra do? He doesn't say, I don't care about these arguments, I'll still believe what I believe. They are not arguing, they're not debating simply to justify their own ego or their raison d'etre. I do find that what happens with academics is that the older they get, it's very difficult to change them because they've invested so much of their lives into their thesis. And then to change that at a later age, there's a lot to lose. It's effectively their identity that they're losing. Unless you're someone like Wittgenstein and he completely changed his perspective. Now, humble individuals like that are very rare. But everything you've invested yourself in, and it shapes your identity, because your beliefs do shape your identity, then to dismiss those and realize, no, actually they were wrong. They don't stand up to reason. Like Mandana Mishra did. And then he decides, as a result of that defeat, he becomes a disciple of Shankaracharya. Because he realizes the arguments hold strong there. That is the spirit of the culture we come from. And there is a whole world of logical reasoning. Every one of the systems of philosophy had to all study Nyaya Darshana, the subject of logic. A very, very, very profound dialogue going on there. Very, very profound teachings going on. And that too in Sanskrit. I look at a commentary like the Brahma Sutras by Shankara. I turn the page. And this is in English, of course, because that level of Sanskrit is way beyond me. The English is almost way beyond me. So what's going on with the Sanskrit? So the ancient world had profound knowledge. And if we go back to the Puranas, where I started this conversation, started this monologue, when we start unlocking what these myths are about, we start seeing something very different. These aren't just merely stories. These are symbolic representations of very profound truths about us within, spiritually, psychologically, and also descriptions of what are happening cosmologically up there. And they're not different. There is an intrinsic link. Whatever is happening up there is happening within. This is our explanatory tool to trying to understand Jyotish. And it's rooted in the beautiful Vedic idea, which seems to have disappeared for so long, and certainly needs a revival. This beautiful Vedic idea of Rita, cosmic order. Everything is flowing. Everything is in natural flow. Mystics have understood this. Mystics have recognized this. And I'll be speaking about them in a moment. But to live within that order, in that acceptance, this nicely moves on to another area that the ancients decided to explore. A very profound area, because all these other subjects that I've mentioned, they are subjects to do with objects of consciousness. Objective, not information within objective reality. Objective, I put in inverted commas. Yet the ancient seers, they explored a very special type of subject, and that is the nature of the subject, the nature of the experiencing subject, the nature of consciousness. That itself is a profound thing. We don't know what consciousness is. We try and define consciousness. It's indefinable. We may use synonyms, awareness, but what is that very thing? Now, that is something that we usually, if anything, most people in their entire lives will never actually look at this very thing about consciousness. Will never look at the experiencing self, but just that which is experienced. And yet this is a very fundamental part of ancient Hindu thought. So much so, the authority that is given to the Veda, the source of authority of all the various traditions within the Hindu world, it forms part of that. It's that important. The end of the Veda, Vedanta, the Upanishads, it's an investigation into the nature of consciousness. Put everything else aside, who am I? There is experience going on of all these things in the world, but who's experiencing these things? And we go through life rarely ever paying any attention to that. We're so entertained by objects. So just explore this a little bit. What is it that the ancients are looking at? Really, the idea, and it's not unique to to India. Other civilizations have explored this area too. Who am I? Who am I outside of name, outside of form? Who am I outside of the labels that have been given to me by society? Who am I on my own terms? Any label that is given to me is a label to do with what? Or to do with whom? To do with this body, to do with this mind. It's to do with identities, external identities. But what is the identity of that is experiencing all these things? This is what they explored, and of course there is no name for it other than we give the label awareness. It is the subject of experience. I objectify my hand, because I'm not my hand, I objectify it. I'm not my body, I objectify it. I'm not my mind, I objectify it. So who is the I that is objectifying? What is the subject? So the ancients looked into these things, and the conclusions were in the Upanishads. But why is this important? It's not simply just a mental exercise. It is for the purpose of something that every individual strives for, from the moment they're born to the moment they die. And it's been happening all throughout time. We are striving for one single thing, and every action that we do lends itself to this. Without any success, ironically, but yet we still do it. And that is for happiness and contentment. Yet we don't always equate these two words. Happiness does lie in contentment. So then we need to look at method. And this is where a profound text like the Bhagavad Gita pops into history. Because what it does, up until then, you have the Upanishads, you have the Bouddha texts, okay, the Buddhist, the Jaina texts. These traditions are existing rather in the forest or in the capacity. These individuals that are engaging with those things are in the capacity of monks, as it were. Well, the Bhagavad Gita comes as a very profound text, because what it does is it addresses some issues. If everybody goes to the forest, we have a social problem. But then if you can only access that reality within, if it is actually within, or we're within it, if you can only access that by going to the forest, then we've just prevented so many people from accessing it. So we have a problem. So what the Bhagavad Gita does is it says, you're able to access that even in your normal life. But see, where the Bhagavad Gita is a profound text is that it's a text on yoga. It's a manual of yoga. And what does yoga mean? We often hear the word union. I prefer the other meaning, to yoke. And the illustration that is, the way the word yoke is usually used is in the context of, say, controlling horses. Now there's an analogy in the Kathopanishad, I believe, where you have a chariot, a passenger, a charioteer, and horses. And of course the connection is there with the reins. And so that's used as an analogy. So the horses are going all over the place. But the horses of the senses need to be, the reins, which are the mind, need to be what are needed to control the horses. And the charioteer is the intellect, is the buddhi. And it's through being sharpened that way we can yoke the horses. So the way to be yoked inside is effectively explained through the Bhagavad Gita. Now how amazing, because it doesn't just give one way. It gives us a number of ways. Whatever your temperament is, whatever your natural inclination is, that can work for you. But there are mechanics behind this. There are mechanics behind how these systems work. So just to illustrate what these systems are, just in brief. Jnana Yoga. Through the path of inquiry can we understand what our essential nature is and come to a state of realization. Through Dhyana Yoga, through meditation. Through Bhakti Yoga, through completely surrendering to your beloved. Beloved with a capital B. and through karma yoga, acting but not worrying about the fruits. Why is this important? Why is understanding what these different systems are, the mechanics behind them, important? Well, when we understand the mechanics of something, we get to appreciate more how it works, why it works, and what we're doing, rather than just being told. So if we have a look at, our investigation to awareness, our attention is on objects. How do we bring our attention back to the subject itself? In other words, how does awareness become aware of itself? How does the eye see itself? How does a torch shine light on itself? How do you take one step closer to yourself? We do that by coming to a state of rest. All these systems, if we look at it, they all allow us to do that. So if we engage in bhakti yoga, bhakti essentially requires us to completely surrender. If you don't have to worry about something and you surrender it to someone else, that pressure goes, and you feel that. There is a relinquishing of all those worries. And when it's done to the absolute, then certainly there is nothing to worry about. There is a coming into a state of rest within. Karma yoga. It's the ego that wants to get results. But the irony is, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. There is no control I have on the outcome of things. I can do things, but I have no control on the outcome. And so the result of that is that I could be frustrated if it doesn't turn out my way. But what does the Gita then tell us? That our focus, our entitlement, our focus should be on action itself and not on the fruits. Because it's going to happen the way it's going to happen. And there is a great feeling of freedom from that. You do the best you can. There's no point worrying afterwards about the result of it. Meditation, the more one goes deep within, there is more of a relinquishing of the sense of the ego. So there itself, one is directly going to a state of stillness within and a state of rest. Because we're going away from the activity of the mind. And essentially all these things what they allow us to do is to be in the present. Because the present is where there is peace. The future and the past don't actually exist. They simply exist as thoughts in the mind. And we're ruled by the mind and its content. So ultimately, if we're looking for happiness, we have some systems in place for us. And the Gita allows us to understand and to explore those very areas. We as a civilization really need to look back at what we've got, because the irony is that the West is now taking on the gems that we have. And yet we're shunning away from them. So my request, well, it's not really a request, my hope is that at some point we do get to recognize this more and more. And I think with the presence of the internet, with social media, more information is getting spread. We are at a very special time in human history where all this information is being accessed. In the past, a handful of people would have had access to this. But now these ideas are being relayed in common language. Every individual who's dealing with self-help is going back to these sorts of ideas. But we forget where they came from. And I think it's our responsibility as those here who are being very conscious about our identity and our heritage. It's perhaps our responsibility to start pushing these things forward. And I think the platform here is one such platform that is allowing us to do this. So I think on that note, I'll end.
Namaste. We hope you enjoyed this Citti Media content. Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.